All right. Representative Harrison.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, panel, for being here. Dr. Ginn, your PhD, what was that in again?
Economics.
Good. Okay, so I need some help here understanding the economic analysis that has been thrown around today from a lot of different people, a lot of different perspectives. I keep hearing something all day that appears to contradict what you just said. You just talked about historic increases and big funding, plus-ups, that sort of thing. One of your co-panelists just used an analogy about us strangling or starving the dog, and I've heard all day long this contention that we have defunded public education, that we have underfunded public education in Texas, that we have held public education funding hostage, in exchange for or not letting parents have ESAs. I don't exactly know the best way to phrase this because there's a lot to unpack here, but I have heard contentions of all those things, but also that if you take inflation into account, that we're somehow cooking the books, or people like you who support school choice are saying that we've actually increased public education once you take inflation into account. That's not quite true. Or I know in the LBB's recent fiscal size up, they showed some growth, but it was much smaller than what you just described. Can you unpack a little bit of those things that I just threw at you in terms of what is exactly the state of public education funding in the state of Texas compared to historical data?
So when you look at what was appropriated in 21-22, or 22-23 budget compared to 24-25 budget, just for public education, there was a $20.3 billion increase, 33.3% to $80.6 billion. If you include all funds, it was an increase of $20.7 billion, or 28.6% increase to $93.1 billion. So there's a substantial increase just from the prior 2 years.
So why does the LBB plus that? Why does it look not as great as you just said? Because I'm hearing lots of people say, no, the LBB shows it was just a tiny increase, or maybe even with inflation a decrease. Why is there a delta? Are you comparing apples to apples here?
There's two key reasons. One, it depends on which base year you're looking at, which they'll use some of these larger increases in 2019 and 2020 during the pandemic. You also have 24-25 are projections based on 22, 23, and other periods. Those are actual expenditures. And even Chairman Morath said this earlier, right? Those are actual expenditures for education compared to the projected amounts for 24-25. So those are not measuring apples to apples, they're apples to oranges. And usually what you see is a plus up, meaning an increase in education funding over each one of those years. So these amounts in there are low compared to the actual amounts that will come out later.
Let me pull that real quick, because you said something that I asked a previous panelist, and it might have been Commissioner Morath himself. I can't recall. It's been a long day. There are people saying that when you look out on the LBB data to 2025, if you take it in real dollars, so not nominal dollars, well, we might be looking at a decrease. Do you think that is the case, that those projections are correct? Or, do we know exactly how much we have spent or are going to spend for 24-25?
We don't know how much we're spending yet, no.
Okay, so those projections could be wrong.
Correct.
And based on historical inaccuracies with government prospective projections, are they typically wrong in which direction from the perspective of the taxpayer?
They're usually too low.
Too low, yeah.
The actual amount comes up higher than those. And you can go through on the Texas PEM's website on financial reporting, look at actuals versus budgeted, and you'll see that they're always over what was budgeted.
So do you agree with what's in the published TEA report, what Commissioner Morath testified to himself, that public education in the state of Texas has never been higher than it is at this very moment as you and I are sitting here talking to each other?
Correct.
Is that unambiguously true?
It's true.
Is there any argument to the contrary?
No.
We've never spent more than we're spending right now. Thank you very much. That's very helpful. So is there any truth, I'll rephrase it this way, and then I'll move on to school choice. Is there any truth to the allegation that the state of Texas has defunded public education?
No.
Yeah, okay. Let's move on to school choice real quick. A couple of perspectives that haven't been brought up that I want to talk about because I do think they're very important. One of the things, I'm a very small government guy, I'm going to guess you probably are too. There are critics of school choice that call it an expansion of government. What are your thoughts on that? Is it the big government position to support education freedom?
No.
Why?
It's the right of the parent to have their God-given right ability to take their kids wherever they want to go. So instead of just looking at the 5.5 million kids that are at public schools, we should be talking about all 6.3 million school-age kids that are across the state. Why are we leaving out the other 800,000 that are there? And that seems to be what all the focus is. Let's pour more money into public schools when really we're missing out on a lot of other benefits that could come from school choice.
And isn't it true that the alternative, because, again, from a small government perspective, from the perspective of a fiscal conservative, isn't it true that the alternative to education freedom is, in fact, a one-size-fits-all government-run monopsony?
Monopoly, yes.
Yeah, monopoly or monopsony.
Yeah. It depends on which market we're talking
Purchasing
about.
or buying, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so that's correct, though, right? So if you're from a small government perspective, ESAs actually reduce the role of government in education.
Correct.
Okay, yeah, I agree with that. Can you talk about the economic incentives of some of the provisions that were in last year's, and I'll be brief on this, I got a couple of these I want to hit through, though, on these hold harmless provisions. Because one of the reasons that people like me support school choice is because I want competition to do in education what it's done everywhere else. I want it to increase quality and reduce prices. What are the economic or other impacts of hold harmless provisions that effectively pay ISDs more even when they're educating fewer students?
So that has been in a couple of bills that have been in the past. I don't know if that'll be in a bill in the future, but it's to hold harmless those kids who are leaving. I was mentioned earlier that you leave a certain amount of the funding in the public school that they left, right? But is that the correct way to do it? I happen to think that that's not the correct way to do it. I would like to see for the funds to actually follow the student. If the parents are choosing an alternative, that means that the public school is not providing the services, the education that is the best fit for that kid. So they should have that opportunity to do that elsewhere.
And I'll go to another topic on school choice that has been addressed, which is this implication that if you start up school choice, if you give parents the chance to take a percentage of their money and send it to the school of their choice, that is somehow going to blow up the budget in the state of Texas. If we had a properly designed, truly universal school choice program where every parent who wanted access to an ESA could take an ESA, put a kid where they want, is there an argument that might actually save money to the state of Texas and to taxpayers? And what would that argument be? Why would that be?
There is one way you could do that. Something I've looked at was actually my research that I've done here is to look at the $17,000 it's spending per child. If you look at the TEA's website and what they're showing, and you look at the 5.5 million kids, that comes out to about $93 billion a year. If we had a $12,000 a year ESA for every child, all 6.3 million, not the 5.5 million, but all 6.3 at $12,000, it would be about $75 billion. We could be saving $18 billion a year on funding, fully funding kids for schools with an ESA across the state. That is savings. That is, you could cut the school district property tax in half. I'm also for eliminating school property taxes. That'd be another way to cut that in half. So we have some opportunities here for substantial changes in Texas.
So am I hearing you correctly in your testimony so far that a well-designed, truly universal ESA program could both save the state money and reduce the role of government in education? Is that correct? Interesting. Okay, I appreciate that testimony very much. Talk to me about the impact of school choice on economic growth, just real quick. What could that do from an economic perspective?
One of the things I want to make sure we mention is that it improves teacher pay. I mean, right now we have a monopsony situation where the teaching services, there's one consumer being 90% of teachers, actually 93% of teachers are not really consumed, but hired by the public schools, right? And so that gives the public school the negotiating power, without negotiating power for 93% of teachers across the state. Whenever you open it up for competition, now they have an ability to go to other places and improve their negotiating power to increase their pay from private school, homeschool, co-ops. They could start their own little schooling if they wanted to. There's a lot of good opportunities for teachers to do that. But you also see an increase in housing values. You see an increase in human capital. When you increase competition throughout the schooling system, usually you have a lot of research that shows that you have improvements in student outcomes and their ability to learn more over time. What that does is it increases the human capital, which allows for you to have more economic growth and prosperity for the future. So all of that brings about more economic growth from something like universal ESAs.
So universal ESAs, in addition to empowering parents, increasing education outcomes for students, could also actually be very good, including financially and for salaries of teachers.
Correct.
Right, well, we got to focus on the teachers. Quick question, under a lot of the bills that were proposed last session, I think all of the ESAs, they would have diverted a fraction of the state spending towards an ESA, right? Because I asked this to a witness earlier, and I got an answer that confused me. Would it not have been the case under the previous ESA proposals that per pupil spending at the ISDs would actually have increased under every ESA proposal that was contemplated last year?
Yes. Because there was massive increases in each one of those.
Correct. Yep. Finally here, there's lots of talk today, but nobody's really addressed it and given it the time that it warrants, I think, on budget deficits and budget stress that the ISDs are undertaking. As a professional economist, what is your opinion of what are the primary drivers of that financial stress at the ISD level?
There are different factors. Each school district is going to have their own variety of issues that they're dealing with. But I think a lot of it has to do with excessive spending. They've tried to spend too much. They over budgeted. They allocated for the additional $6 or $7 billion that was going to go into their budgets as they were creating those budgets. And so that created problems moving forward that they never adjusted for. Also, something that was interesting that was mentioned earlier today by Commissioner Morath is about $20 billion, if not more, was still in reserves by these public schools. Why are they sitting on reserves and then they're claiming that they're running massive deficits of taxpayer money? Remember, government school districts have no money. It comes from us, the taxpayer. So this is an additional way for them to raise our taxes in the process. And if you're talking about spending $2 billion more a year or other amounts that are higher, where's that money going to come from? Right now, we've been, the legislature's fully funded schools because they've been funding the budget year after year. All that is fully funding these schools.
So by
I'm not sure what
definition,
their
as we're sitting here
problem is.
today, public schools in Texas are also fully funded.
Yes.
Okay, and then last question, because you mentioned this, and I do think it's really important. We don't talk about this enough. Everybody wants to talk about the revenue, but not where the dollars are going. I've tried to suss this out earlier. It's not getting to the classroom. It's not getting to the teachers. We've got to change that. Efforts last session were unfortunately unsuccessful. But what is the impact of local school ISD debt on property taxes? I cannot tell you how many people are in my office concerned they're going to be taxed out of their homes. Yeah. Well, one of the biggest drivers is school taxes. What is the impact of local school debt on people's property tax bill?
So according to the Bond Review Board here in Texas, school district debt is $120 billion. So that increases the amount of the tax rate, that increases the amounts you're paying in taxes. That goes to a lot of facilities and other things, but some of it's used for operations as well. And this is another area where I'm thinking, hey, look, why are they spending so much? So it's really a spending problem. It's not a revenue problem, it's a spending problem. And this has continued to be a problem with school districts, and it's something we got to get control over.
Last question. Do you think as we contemplate ESA's next session, given that 34 states approximately have already empowered their parents with some form of school choice, including many with full universal, should we take partial steps since we're just new to this, or should we go full universal and empower every parent in the state of Texas with education freedom and give every child an ESA who wants one?
We can't wait anymore. We're falling well behind. This time is now for universal education, saving the account, not in a multi-year approach. Do it all at one time.
Thank you, Doctor. Very helpful. Appreciate it. Thank you, Chairman.